One of the first assignments in my Christian ministries classes was, guess what? A Pecha Kucha. It was to be about how we perceived our calling up to that point in our journey. How beautiful and ironic it is that I have the chance tonight to communicate how my story has developed since then, in this unique form. I lived a pretty decent life as a child. However, by the time I hit junior high, I began to feel like something was off in my soul. I began to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. By the age of 19, I got clean and I began to turn my life around. Shortly after that, it became clear what I should be doing with my life. I need to become an addiction counselor, right? Off to PCC I went to start my training as a certified addiction counselor. About halfway through the training program, I came to faith in Jesus. After my dramatic conversion, my life was rattled and I began to sense a call to pursue full-time ministry. I knew this would mean giving up my dream of being an addiction counselor and everything that I had been working towards. I told God, thank you for everything, but I got my own plans. At this time, I kept having these visions and dreams of being a pastor. Being a new convert, I didn't want to confuse my dramatic conversion experience with a calling to ministry. I was terrified and I didn't want to change the trajectory of my life. I had my own plans. So for the next year, I kept stuffing down this longing deep into my heart where I thought I could never be touched by anything. I am stubborn. I've always had to learn things the hard way. For instance, a few nights ago when I was working on this presentation, I was struggling. I couldn't seem to piece together my thoughts when my lovely girlfriend Nicole gave me some advice that I chose to ignore. 3 hours later, I found out that this was the very piece of advice that I needed to heed. This is how I have learned many crucial lessons in my life, the hard way. One day when I was in a PCC class, I became overwhelmed with the conviction that I was in the wrong place. I left right in the middle of class and went to my car and began to pray. It was as if God was telling me, son, you are living in active defiance of my will. This is not where you're supposed to be. I admitted defeat and told God I would go wherever he would lead me. I began looking for schools to begin training for ministry. After visiting Warner Pacific and having a conversation with our Bible professor, Dr. Carver, I knew that this is the place for me. I began a journey here deeper and more transformative than I ever imagined, through which I have been pushed out of my comfort zone regularly and learned more about the heart of God and who he was called me to be. My second semester here, my mother, she got diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer. Everything in my life got turned completely upside down, and I didn't know what to think or how to feel. I could barely get out of bed in the morning, and I was plagued with thoughts trying to figure out how God could possibly let this happen to someone I loved so much. During the time of her diagnosis, my mom spent a week and a half at St. Vincent's Hospital here in Portland. During a surgery on one of her lungs, we found out that there were tumors that had spread to them. It was a very hard and very scary time, and we didn't know what was going on. She asked me to be her spiritual advisor in the face of this uncertain time, and I agreed. After I left this visit with my mom, I began to reflect, and I started to realize that I love hospitals. I have always felt at home in them. I feel a warmth in my heart every time I think about the experience that I've had in hospitals throughout my life. Could I be called to work in one? I began to think that maybe, just possibly, I didn't know what I was doing as her spiritual advisor, but God began to fill in the gaps where I was weak. When she was faced with her mortality, she began to realize what is truly important in life, seeking God and loving others. As she realized this, I began to realize that I am called to walk with people in these delicate moments in their life. It became clear that God was calling me to pursue serving in hospital ministry in the capacity of a chaplain, so that I could walk alongside people in heavy places like the one my mom is in. Celtic tradition teaches the notion of thin places. Thin places are physical spaces where the boundary between heaven and earth is especially weak, and God seems to be easier to perceive. Hospitals are most definitely a thin place. Some of life's most critical moments happen in hospitals. Moments that tear away all the temporal and hollow idols that can consume our daily lives, leaving us aware of what is truly important. Moments like birth and like death. Jesus calls his followers to care for the sick. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about how the righteous care for him by caring for those in need. Jesus said, I was sick and you visited me, and then he goes on to say that by caring for the least of these, you cared for me. God is calling me to care for those who are in need of spiritual and physical healing in the mission field, which is a hospital. In the Old Testament story of Jacob, Jacob wrestles with God for an entire night and is eventually subdued by God by a crippling blow to the hip. Even though he spent all this time fighting with God, God eventually won and blessed him in the end. I too have been struggling with God to embrace my call as a chaplain. I have been afraid that I am inadequate to fulfill this role and have been struggling to embrace it, like during my time at PCC. Last weekend I revisited a Bible verse that spoke to my fears and hesitancy to embrace this role. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Another source of encouragement for me has been reflecting on the words of an old professor of mine, Dr. John Johnson. He once told our class that God does not call us to do something that we think we can do on our own strength. A true calling from God always results in reliance upon Him, and that is where I have been going wrong, trying to embrace a call from God while relying on my own strength. Friedrich Buechner once said, "The place you are called to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Every person in this room has been created by God with a thing that speaks to their heart in a way that nobody else can hear. If that thing cries out to the people that Jesus has called us to serve, then that is your calling. Jesus told his followers to let their light shine before all men so that the glory of God can be known by all. By living into God's calling, we allow God to shine the light of Christ into the darkness of the world.